Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a really complex subject today.
Yeah, it's definitely one that requires looking under the hood of how modern influence actually works.
Right. So I want you to start by picturing this specific scenario. Imagine one individual who currently controls rockets, satellites, artificial intelligence development, a massive share of the electric vehicle market, a major global social media platform, and
Literally the physical infrastructure for global internet access.
yes,
Huh.
the infrastructure itself.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. And this person was not elected to any office. He doesn't run a sovereign nation. He doesn't command a traditional standing army.
Right.
Yet, despite lacking those traditional markers of authority, there's a very serious debate right now about whether he might actually wield more functional power than many of the world's actual heads of state.
It is a staggering premise when you lay out the full scope of those assets side by side like that.
And that is exactly the focus of our analysis today. We are working from a comprehensive debate brief titled The Musk Mandate: Global Power Without the Ballot.
Good title.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to objectively unpack both sides of what the brief presents as a defining question of our modern era. Is Elon Musk the most powerful, unelected man in the world?
Before we go any further, it is crucial to establish our operational ground rules for you listening.
Yes, please do.
Because this topic intersects with global politics, massive wealth accumulation, and obviously a highly visible figure. It is so easy to view this through a partisan lens.
Very easy.
Right, so we want to be absolutely clear. We are not here to take a side.
None at all.
We aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoint. We are not here to declare anyone a visionary hero or a monopolistic villain. Our goal today is strictly analytical.
Just the facts.
Exactly. We're going to examine the arguments exactly as they are laid out in this source text to help you understand how power operates in the 21st century, entirely independent of how you might feel about the person currently wielding it.
Leave the preconceived notions at the door. We're here for the actual architecture of the arguments. Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to start with the case for yes. The argument presented in the text that Musk possesses a level of power genuinely unprecedented for a private citizen.
Right.
The brief builds this argument on a few key pillars, starting with space dominance.
Space dominance, yeah.
Yeah, through SpaceX, the text notes that Musk controls the most advanced private space company ever built, effectively dominating modern orbital logistics.
What's fascinating here is this specific detail the brief highlights regarding the Starlink network.
The satellite internet.
Right, Starlink provides satellite internet across the planet. But the text points out a scenario that crystallizes what this means in practical geopolitical terms.
Yeah.
In some active war zones, entire military and civilian communications systems rely completely on this specific commercial network.
Completely rely on it.
Completely. I want you to consider the gravity of that dynamic. We are not discussing civilian access to streaming services or rural broadband here.
Right.
We are discussing the literal command control infrastructure of global conflicts.
But how does reliance on a private company fundamentally change the nature of a conflict, though? Surely sovereign militaries have their own redundant communication systems, so they aren't perpetually reliant on a private CEO.
You would think so. But the brief argues that the technology moved faster than the military procurement process.
Ah.
Yeah, in these intensely volatile environments, traditional infrastructure is often destroyed immediately. Starlink works because it relies on a constellation of low Earth orbit satellites and easily deployable ground terminals.
So it could be activated instantly.
Instantly. And consequently, one single unelected man technically controls the switchboard. He has the infrastructure to influence who maintains internet access and who loses it during a live conflict.
Which is wild because communication is the lifeblood of modern warfare.
Exactly. To have a private citizen holding the keys to that infrastructure represents a level of geopolitical power resting entirely outside the traditional bounds of a nation-state or international treaty.
That really does reframe the traditional understanding of warfare. I mean, you typically think of generals, presidents, the United Nations dictating the terms of engagement, not a chief executive officer evaluating terms of service.
Right, it's a completely new paradigm.
But the text doesn't isolate this influence to just the edge of the atmosphere. It brings it directly to the flow of global communication.
Twitter or X?
Exactly. The brief places heavy emphasis on the acquisition of X, formerly Twitter. The argument is that he didn't just purchase a technology company. He acquired one of the most influential political discussion platforms on the planet.
And the user demographic is what makes that specific acquisition so critical to the YS argument.
Yeah, the text specifically catalogs who utilizes this platform daily. We are talking sitting presidents, international journalists, lawmakers, world leaders.
It functions as the de facto global town square.
It really does. And the brief points out that through sole ownership, policy changes on that platform can shape global political conversations almost instantaneously.
The algorithms.
Yes, the algorithms that dictate what content is amplified, the rules regarding who is permitted to speak, the data access granted to third parties.
A single modification to the platform's algorithm fundamentally alters how world leaders communicate with their citizens.
And how the press distributes information.
Right. And for most historical titans of industry controlling either the dominant orbital logistics company or the primary global political communications platform would secure their legacy.
That would be enough.
It would be plenty. But the brief continues into a third pillar, arguing that he is simultaneously driving the technologies that will dictate the future of human infrastructure.
The text lists these out, and the breadth is just significant. Through Tesla, the argument is that he catalyzed the entire global transition toward electric vehicles and autonomous driving.
Huge on its own.
Huge. Then, through Neuralink, he is developing brain-computer interfaces, essentially trying to bridge the gap between human cognition and digital processing in real time.
Which sounds like science fiction.
It does. And then through XAI, he is actively competing in the rapid race to build artificial general intelligence.
This is where the YS argument culminates in a point about synthesis. The text asserts that few people in the entire span of human history have simultaneously dictated the trajectories of transportation, artificial intelligence, energy storage, social media, and space exploration.
The simultaneous part is key.
That is the critical factor, the simultaneous nature of this control. It is essentially absolute vertical and horizontal integration on a geopolitical scale.
Like a modern-day monopoly, but across entirely different sectors.
Exactly. You might analyze a railroad tycoon in the 19th century or an oil baron in the 20th, but their dominance was generally confined to a single vertical.
Right, they just did oil or just railroads.
They did not control the physical transit, the communications networks, the energy grid, and the cutting-edge scientific research of their day all at the exact same time.
It is a compounding type of influence. If you control the data flowing through the social square, that data can theoretically train the artificial intelligence.
Which then gets integrated.
Right, which can then be integrated into the autonomous transportation or the space logistics.
It feeds itself.
It does, but here's where it gets really interesting. Because the source text does not allow that narrative of absolute dominance to sit unchallenged.
No, it isn't.
It pivots sharply to the perspective of the critics. We move to the case for NO, the argument that society is vastly exaggerating the actual functional power this one billionaire possesses.
The foundation of this counterargument is essentially a reality check regarding jurisdiction and the monopoly on ultimate authority.
The government.
Right. The critics argue that at the end of the day, sovereign governments still hold the real power, simply because governments possess the authority to create and enforce the rules.
And the text provides very clear examples of these jurisdictional limits. It asks who regulates space launches.
The Federal Aviation Administration.
Exactly. The FAA and equivalent global bodies do. Who controls actual kinetic military power? Sovereign governments do.
Not CEOs.
Not CEOs. Who creates the literal statutory laws that all these interrelated companies must follow? Elected legislatures.
The brief explicitly states that if regulators decide to act, companies like Tesla or SpaceX can be immediately restricted. They can be fined or even grounded.
Just shut down.
Yeah. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the critics are establishing that Musk's power, as vast and cross-industrial as it appears, exists strictly within systems that are ultimately controlled by elected leaders.
So he's still playing in their sandbox.
Exactly. He can engineer the most advanced rocket in human history, but he legally cannot launch it without clearance from a government agency.
Right.
He can operate a sprawling social media platform, but he must operate it within the legal and regulatory frameworks of the specific countries where it is accessed. Or he faces bans and massive fines.
The argument here is that his power is entirely conditional.
Very conditional.
But how does the brief reconcile the difference between having the theoretical power to regulate and the actual political will to do so?
That's a great question.
Because the text also introduces a historical argument here,
Yeah.
suggesting that this scale of corporate power is not a new phenomenon. It walks us through some very familiar comparisons to argue that we have seen powerful unelected figures navigate these regulatory frameworks before.
Yes, it compares his current influence to other modern titans of industry to establish a historical precedent.
The text points to Jeff Bezos, who controls massive swaths of global commerce and cloud computing infrastructure through Amazon.
Huge influence.
It points to Mark Zuckerberg, who controls the social connections, messaging, and personal data of literally billions of users through Meta.
Also massively powerful.
And it references Bill Gates, who fundamentally shaped modern computing and business technology through Microsoft.
Right.
The text is asking us to look at this established history of immensely powerful billionaires and question whether Musk is truly a unique threat to global structures, or if he is simply the latest iteration of a very long historical trend of wealthy industrialists operating within government boundaries.
That framing is crucial. And it leads directly into the final, perhaps most significant limitation the text outlines for the NO argument: market vulnerability.
The markets always have a say.
Always. The critics emphasize that an elected politician derives power from a constitution, or a legal mandate, or military backing. A billionaire's power, however, depends entirely on the unpredictable forces of public opinion and global markets.
The brief spells this out as a profound fragility.
It really is.
It argues that if consumers decide to stop purchasing the vehicles, or if users abandon the social platform, or if institutional investors lose confidence and pull their capital side, his influence shrinks rapidly.
Instantly.
Unlike a political leader, he does not have the power to levy taxes to fund his projects. He
No.
does not have the power to draft a workforce or an army.
No.
His power requires constant ongoing market approval.
If that public trust or investor confidence evaporates, the leverage he holds over those industries evaporates alongside it.
So what does this all mean? We have these two incredibly detailed frameworks presented in the text.
Yeah.
On one side, the argument points to an individual controlling the foundational infrastructure of the future across 5 different massive global industries.
And on the other side, the argument insists he can be neutralized by a government regulatory agency or a severe stock market correction tomorrow morning.
Exactly. The text frames this for the reader as a dilemma between two contrasting personas. Is this individual a visionary innovator who is effectively pushing humanity forward precisely because he can move faster than bureaucracy?
Or is he a private citizen with far too much global influence operating without any real democratic accountability?
Which is a heavy question.
This raises an important question, and it is the central structural debate highlighted in the source text. Should any unelected person possess this degree of unilateral leverage?
Right. Let's analyze the friction between these two realities we've just laid out, because this is where the brief gets really deep.
It really does.
Yeah.
You mentioned the speed of innovation versus the speed of bureaucracy just a moment ago.
Yeah.
That temporal mismatch seems to be the core vulnerability in the critic's argument.
How does a traditional legislative body attempt to regulate someone moving across 5 cutting-edge industries simultaneously?
It's almost impossible.
The NO argument relies heavily on the premise that the government can simply pass a law or issue a regulation to keep this power in check. But does the text suggest these traditional bodies actually have the technical agility to do that effectively?
Not really. The brief hints at a severe structural flaw in that traditional regulatory model. The critics correctly state that governments create the laws companies must follow.
Sure.
However, the legislative process is inherently reactive and deliberately slow.
Extremely slow.
Laws are typically written after a technology exists, and often years after it has been widely adopted and integrated into society.
Meanwhile, the YSS argument highlights entities like Neuralink and XAI. These organizations are attempting to build the infrastructure of tomorrow today. By the time a congressional committee holds hearings, gathers expert testimony, and drafts legislation to regulate a brain-computer interface or a new iteration of artificial general intelligence, the company developing it might already be 2 paradigm shifts ahead.
It creates a scenario where the regulatory agencies are constantly fighting the last war.
Always playing catch-up.
Yes.
Let's look closely at the historical comparisons the text uses to bolster the NO argument. The comparisons to Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Gates. The brief uses them to argue this is just a normal historical cycle,
Right.
but based strictly on the evidence in the YS column, is it entirely accurate to equate them?
It requires us to deeply analyze the nature of the specific industries involved.
Yeah.
I mean, the achievements of the others are undeniably massive.
Absolutely.
Revolutionizing global logistics and retail, reshaping human social networking, establishing the operating system for the personal computer. These are world-altering feats. But they are predominantly consumer-facing or enterprise software technologies. The YES argument differentiates Musk by pointing to foundational geopolitical and physical infrastructure.
Returning to that specific Starlink example in the text, the reliance of active military zones on commercial satellite internet.
Precisely. We are not analyzing whether a consumer can purchase goods with overnight shipping or how they update their social networks. We're analyzing whether an entire geographic region engaged in an armed conflict has the fundamental ability to coordinate defense.
Which is staggering.
That level of direct influence over raw geopolitical stability and military logistics operates on a qualitatively different plane than dominating retail e-commerce or software licensing.
Yet the NO column counters that entire line of thinking by bringing up market vulnerability, the idea that if investors flee, the power inherently shrinks.
Right.
But let's apply that market logic to the geopolitical infrastructure. If an entire communication system in a volatile region relies on this specific satellite network, how does market vulnerability function as a check and balance?
That's a great point.
I mean, the military personnel on the ground needing that internet connection to survive cannot exactly vote with their wallets and choose a competitor in the middle of a firefight.
That is exactly where the traditional market check argument becomes highly complicated. The market is highly effective at regulating consumer products.
Like cars.
Yes. If consumers object to a chief executive's behavior, or if a competitor releases a better product, they can simply choose to purchase a different electric vehicle.
Sure.
In that scenario, the market vulnerability the critics point to functions perfectly. Capital flees, the stock price drops, and influence wanes.
But the text implies that dynamic changes when you introduce monopolies on critical infrastructure.
It does. The market does not effectively regulate monopolistic geopolitical infrastructure in real time.
Because there's no alternative.
Right. If a sovereign government or an allied military is heavily reliant on a specific private space launch provider,
Yeah.
because literally no other entity on the planet has the capability to deliver payloads to orbit as frequently, reliably, or cost-effectively.
Yep.
The traditional investor confidence or consumer boycott check becomes heavily diluted. The government cannot simply take its business elsewhere if elsewhere does not possess the requisite rockets.
It creates a fascinating, almost paradoxical tension in the brief. The critics maintain that his power is an illusion because the government ultimately holds the leash.
While the supporters essentially argue that the government's leash is far too short to reach the frontier where he is already operating.
That's a great way to put it. Furthermore, the text suggests that because these different companies are controlled by one individual, the leverage in one industry might insulate him from vulnerabilities in another.
That cross-industry leverage is a critical component of the debate. If a regulatory agency attempts to aggressively penalize the social media platform, does the government have to weigh how that executive might respond regarding the defense contracts held by the aerospace company?
That is incredibly messy.
The source text lays this all out, not to dictate a specific conclusion to the reader, but to demonstrate how incredibly complex and intertwined modern influence has become. We are no longer dealing with discrete, isolated monopolies.
It forces a reevaluation of what actual power looks like, and that brings us to why you listening to this deep dive right now should care about the mechanics of this debate.
Because it affects everyone.
It does, because this is not an abstract exercise for a political science seminar. Whether you are driving on a highway increasingly populated by autonomous vehicles or scrolling through a social media feed that shapes your political reality.
Or reading about AI.
Right, reading about the rapid acceleration of artificial intelligence or just existing in a global economy that is increasingly reliant on commercial space infrastructure. This debate touches the literal, physical, and digital infrastructure of your daily life.
The source text perfectly captures the defining tension of our current era. We are living through a transitional period where the staggering velocity of private capitalized innovation is constantly colliding with the traditional, deliberate, and often sluggish checks of public oversight.
The tortoise and the hare, but with rockets.
Exactly. The brief forces us to acknowledge that the old frameworks society used to measure ultimate power, like who commands the largest standing army or who won the most recent national election, might simply no longer be sufficient to understand how the world's operating system actually functions today.
The fundamental rules of geopolitical leverage are being rewritten in real time by private citizens. And before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own, building directly on the arguments we just unpacked.
Okay.
We spent a significant amount of time analyzing the source text's assertion that a billionaire's power is ultimately kept in check by their reliance on markets and public trust.
Right, the vulnerability argument.
The argument is that the perpetual need for investor confidence and consumer capital forces them to remain somewhat accountable. But think about the logical extreme of that premise.
Where does it lead?
Right. If an unelected billionaire's power is kept in check primarily by the need for market approval and profit, what happens if a tech titan becomes so unfathomably wealthy and their infrastructure becomes so deeply entrenched in global operations that they simply no longer care about profit margins or public opinion?
How do market-based checks and balances function when the individual at the top of the structure decides they don't actually need the market's money anymore?
When the ultimate final check on your systemic power is the threat of losing capital, what happens to global accountability when you possess more capital than you could ever possibly lose?
It's a chilling thought.
It is a complex question to chew on as these technologies continue to integrate into our lives. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a great discussion.
We hope our analysis of this brief leaves you with a sharper, more nuanced perspective on the true mechanics of power in the 21st century. Until next time, keep questioning the systems around you, keep analyzing the sources, and take care.